Well, hello boys and girls. Thanks for joining us for the last couple of chapters of Mr. Mousey, Beyond the Silver Sea and Adventure. So we left them, the wheelers, the seagulls had carried Mr. Mousey and Mr. Rabbit all the way until the darkness, and now I don't think they've got too far to go, but they're not too sure where they are yet. Chapter 38, Homecoming. I don't want to worry you, but have you seen where we are? The shakiness in his friend's voice made Mr. Mousey alert pretty quickly. Rubbing sleep from his eyes, he pushed himself out of his sleeping bag and took a look around. It was the tree that did it. The oak glen. They were in the wildlands. They had spent the night beside the very tree that they had found the magic carpet in so long before. Now, whether it was the memory of their early experiences here or just the atmosphere of the place, neither said anything as they quickly but quietly packed. It was early and dew hung heavily on the tufted grass as they made to leave. The direction they knew and the path lay before them, but as they began to slip away, Mr. Mousey stopped. "1 minute," he whispered. Silently he padded over to the hollow tree and slipped the rolled carpet from off his pack. In a second he had dropped it back into the deep hole inside the tree and turned to join his friend. Mr. Rabbit didn't question him. Perhaps it just felt right. Perhaps the extra weight could now make the difference between life and death. Mr. Rabbit had not even mentioned breakfast, and that by itself was a sign of what he was feeling of being in the wildlands. They made off at a trot. It was some distance to the crossing they knew, and the less time they spent in the barren wild lands lent the greater chance to getting out undetected. And they nearly did. Unbelievably, they were almost at the same spot as where they had been on their last flight out when Mr. Rabbit heard the howls. "Faster!" was all he said in a dry whisper to his friend, and Mr. Mousey needed no explanation as to why. He picked up the pace and was glad of the lack of a cumbersome rug. Wolves have a great sense of smell. No one smell is like another, and when this pack caught the scent, it was one they recognized. It was the scent of food that had once escaped them and left them drooling all day afterwards. Perhaps it was this that gave them the extra burst of speed, whatever it was. They were soon bearing down on the prey ahead, and this time they would not lose it. In his mind, Mr. Mousey was out of ideas. They had no rug, and even if they had, it was no longer working anyway. They were leaner and fitter than they had been before, but a good mile or two lay before them, and wolves are fast. And these wolves were very fast. In a few minutes the friends heard the howling close behind them, and fear began to freeze their hearts. But only begin to. These two had been through much since their last frenzied escape from this place, and in many ways they were not the same creatures they had been before. Fear quickly turned to frustration, frustration to anger, anger channel into resolve. "Right! That's it!" cried Mr. Rabbit. "I've just about had it up to here." He chopped a paw to his forehead. He dropped his pack and pulled out a leather sheath. Mr. Mousey wasn't quite so angry, but he was equally determined. "Let's do it, Mr. Rabbit." He pulled out his own sheath just as four ugly, frothing grey shapes came over the rise behind them like a quartet of cruise missiles. Their gaping mouths, red and slobbering, showed row after row of flesh-tearing teeth that any shark would have been proud to own. great filthy feet-covered claws that bit and tore at the ground as they defiled the ground beneath. Great yellow eyes now locked onto the two creatures before them, and the only thought in their twisted, dark minds was kill, kill, kill. Mr. Rabbit's mind was pretty excited too, and now so was his mouth, as he strode purposely towards the closing predators. "Come on, then!" he hollered. He began to run at the wolves, and his friend had to react quickly so as not to be left behind. "You big dirty lumps of mangy fur! Mess with the rabbit and the mouse, would you?" All sense of fear had left him, and probably all normal sense too. He was livid. Raising Nogger's cutlass above his head, he let out a tremendous, un-rabbit-like, but very pirate-like yell. It crossed the mind of the lead wolf at that moment that things were not as they ought to be. The natural balance of nature seemed to be well off, and it didn't feel good. Not one bit. In front of him, a rabbit, and slightly behind, a mouse, of all things. Were neither of them doing the normal running away in terror before death thing that he had come to expect in the hunter versus the hunted process? What was more unsettling to his simple mind was the unavoidable fact that they were, in fact, attacking him. Not good. At the last minute, his indecision made him swerve off to one side and overshoot the two altogether. The two immediately behind them had no time to do any such thing, and they were totally unprepared for what came down upon them in the way of sore, nasty, and very painful. For that is what two pirate cutlasses, wielded by two very upset pirate-trained heroes, does to undefended hairy wolf types. The fourth wolf, sensing that something was up, had already put the brakes on and had managed to get stopped just a few feet short of a rather alarming scene. It was a scene made all the more alarming by the fact that none of the wolves had a plan for dealing with it. Wolf school was pretty basic in those days, still is probably, and dealt with a limited set of subjects. How to kill something until it's dead and eat it was followed by, after a break, with how to kill something else and eat it. Group discussions in free time was usually based around lunch and whose looked the most scared just before it became lunch. Playtime was nearly always, let's pretend to kill something and eat it. And even on the way home, young wolves would spend little time chatting and more time trying to kill something and eat it. At no time did any of these wolves recall anything about what to do when your food is armed and dangerous. This lack of knowledge was very much missed at that particular moment, as a yelling Mr. Rabbit and a very determined Mr. Mousey beat hairy lumps out of two totally unprepared wolves. Now there is a saying, discretion is the better part of valour. Now none of the wolves would have known that, of course, but they got around to demonstrating the principle remarkably quickly. Put simply, it means, if you are not winning, run away as fast as possible. The two who had been at the wrong end of the cutlasses now did that, and left as quickly as they had come, their tails between their legs, a pitiful whining coming from their still slobbering mouths. That left the fourth wolf looking shiftily at Mr. Rabbit, while Mr. Mousey turned and faced the first, which was now facing the mouse. Suddenly, Mr. Mousey let out a shout. The woods, the river, and home! Each then charged a wolf, cutlasses swinging, fires in their eyes. No more persuasion was needed for the yellow-eyed creatures, and with howls and yelps they followed in the footsteps of their comrades. Mr. Mousey stood for a few moments, listening to the growing silence. and also to the bumpity bump of their excited hearts. "Did I just do what I think I just did?" asked an incredulous rabbit. "You certainly did," replied his friend, who would like to have given a big laugh, but was still a bit shaky to do so. "We chased the wolves. Every one. I could have been killed. What was I thinking of?" What they had just done was beginning to hit Mr. Rabbit, and he could hardly believe it. Suddenly the two of them threw their arms round one another. "You're a hero, Mr. Rabbit. You're a hero, Mr. Mousey." They picked up their things and arms around their shoulders, headed off towards the river crossing. Soon they were laughing, and tears rolled down their eyes as the laughter increased and the backslapping continued all the way to the river. Within half an hour they were both across the river and at the dale. Mr. Rabbit looked around. "It seems so long ago that we left here. Everything is the same, but different too, if you know what I mean," he said slowly. The dale was indeed more or less just as they had left it. But the two animals who stood there were indeed somehow different. Wider in experience, deeper, yet the same pals who had passed this way so long before. They turned south and with the river to their right headed for the pine tree line. The refreshing smell of pine soon surrounded them, and they laughed and chatted as they walked. Pine gradually gave way to oak and beech. Mossy boulders grew out of the ground, and blackbirds and larks filled the air with song. Soon they were entering the woods that were home, and straight away they heard a familiar voice call, "Hey, Mr. Mousey! Mr. Rabbit!" It was Sammy Squirrel. He scampered down the tree he was on and rushed over to the two friends. "Wow, you're back! I can't believe it! Have you just arrived? Are those swords? Real swords? How did you get here? Where have you been? Do you know how long you've been away?" Mr. Mousey had to interrupt him to get a word in. "Sammy, old pal, you have no idea how good it is to see you." With that, the squirrel found himself being almost lifted off the ground as his two friends hugged him at the same time. "Have you been home yet? Are you going home now? Will I go and get Billy Badger? Does Owl know you're back?" Sammy was full of things to say. "Is everything you say going to be a question or what?" asked Mr. Rabbit. "Only, if it is, speaking for me myself, personally, I don't want to be answering a lot of questions on an empty stomach." And so, with Sammy chittering away beside them, they continued their way on into the woods. The path wound on by Owl's house, and they climbed up to knock at his door. There was no reply. "Must be out somewhere," shrugged Mr. Mousey. He was very disappointed. He was particularly keen to meet Owl. There were quite a few things he was keen to talk to him about. "Oh well," came the voice of the rabbit. "Home then. I'm sure the old boy will turn up sometime or other." Heading on, they soon came across more of their friends, all of whom were excited and pleased to see them. It took a great many hugs and welcome backs before they came out the other side of the woods and got anywhere near home. Mrs. Crow and the entire family acted in the most excited way either of the pals had ever seen her do before. She was usually so calm and collected. It was strange to see her so emotional. The friends felt privileged indeed. Ferdy Ferret, Willy Water Rat, Harry Hare and Billy Badger all popped up along the way. It seemed that news of their return was spreading rapidly. The mouse and the rabbit found themselves very much the centre of attention, the centre of attraction. Their pals grinning at them in a standoffish sort of way. Not because they weren't absolutely delighted to see them, but because the mouse and the rabbit had obviously seen and been places outside their wildest imaginings, and it made them seem somehow more important and mysterious. Well, it didn't take long, however, for the atmosphere to thaw, and soon jokes and laughter echoed along the riverbank as they ambled along in a huddled crowd. And you can have your fish back, put in Harry. Back? Killer? Why, where was he? Asked Mr. Rabbit. Weren't you just popping in and feeding him at my house? Oh, I soon got fed up with that. Fighting my way through that jungle you call a back garden. I just brought him home and fed him there, though I soon ran out of fish food. Oh, sorry, said Mr. Rabbit. But what did you feed him then? Carrots. Carrots? Yes, carrots. After a while it got hard to tell the difference, actually. I hope he's still in the bowl. Well, Mr. Rabbit was far from convinced that carrots were a staple diet for goldfish, no matter how much he and Harry loved them, but he decided not to be too picky about it and thanked him for his attention to Killer the goldfish. Billy was spending most of the time as they walked just looking at his two friends. Are you all right, Billy? Asked Mr. Mousey. You seem very quiet. They had got as far as the meadow that led up from the river to Mr. Mousey's house. Billy looked into his little friend's face. When you never came back for ages and ages, he began, I was so worried that perhaps you'd both never come back again, and I thought it was maybe all my fault. Your fault? Whatever can you mean, Billy? Asked Mr. Mousey, not understanding at all. Well, said Billy, if I hadn't brought that book, maybe you would have stayed at home and not gone off and got killed. Mr. Mousey tried not to laugh at his honest old friend, whose face looked guiltily down at him. Why, Billy, you only delivered the post. I don't think that makes you an accomplice to murder. Especially not since we're not killed, if that isn't sort of obvious, which I would like to think is, chirped up Mr. Rabbit. Mr. Mousey stopped and pointed. Look, he said to nobody in particular. Home. And so it was. Only 100 feet or so away, a little green door was visible over the long grass in the front garden. In the windows, yellow curtains shone out onto the world, and Mr. Mousey's heart felt like laughing, crying, jumping for joy, and weeping for happiness. Home. The others felt that now was the time to let the two have a bit of their own time, and promising to see them the next day, left after a few more hugs and reminders of how good it was to see them again. Do you mind if I look in before I go home to my own wee hole? Asked Mr. Rabbit as they approached the garden path. If you don't look in and have a cup of tea and a bun, I'll punch your nose, joked his friend, and they proceeded up to the door. That's funny, said Mr. Mousey as he put his hand to the handle. The door is ajar. For a moment, Mr. Rabbit had pretty nasty visions of Discaladorian soldiers waiting in ambush, or fiery dragons, or even sneaky wolves. But before he had time to point out what he imagined were rather important thoughts, Mr. Mousey had walked on in. The first thing that was noticeable was that the fire was lit. The second was the smell of fresh buns and the bubbling of a kettle coming from the kitchen. The third was the person sitting on one of the armchairs facing them, which was a bit of a surprise to both of them, to say the least. Aha! I thought I'd prepare a bit of a welcome, said the intruder. Owl! Cried two voices at once. Oh, and don't worry, I knocked before entering, added the owl. I've baked some cherry buns, and I think, he said, rising from the chair and heading for the kitchen, I think that'll be your tea just about ready. A few minutes later, the three were seated around Mr. Mousey's table, the fire flickering merrily and buns disappearing at an alarming rate, well, especially from Mr. Rabbit's plate. After a while, Owl broke the silence that had fallen as they chomped away enjoying the cosy supper. So, you're back then. Well, no points for that one, said Mr. Rabbit, but I'll give you 10 points if you know where we have been. Mr. Mousey said, looking curiously at Owl. I have a funny feeling you might be being too generous with your points there, Rabbit. What? But we've only just got home and we haven't told anybody anything yet. Even so, replied the mouse, looking over to the owl again. Perhaps you know a little already, Owl. Owl let the question lie for a moment before answering. Well, now, I'm sure I hardly know what you mean, Mr. Mousey, but I have to say I am very pleased that dear Mr. Rabbit finished well in your adventure. Yes, like I always say, at this Mr. Rabbit interrupted, that an adventure once begun is best finished at its end. Mr. Mousey looked confused, but Old Owl merely smiled at the rabbit and nodded. Indeed, indeed. Do you know a seagull called Kirak? Asked Mr. Mousey, not wanting to be diverted from several questions he had been itching to ask the bird. Oh, yes, in fact, it was Kirak I sent the book on to you with. I think I would be right in saying that you would have needed it. Yes, it turned out to be a great help, right enough, but I also think he may have turned up at other times, especially when we were in a bit of a pickle. Do you know anything about that? Mr. Mousey, you do have a lot of things in your head, smiled the wise old bird, and maybe sometime we'll all have a good old chinny wag about the whole thing. But for now, however, at this he rose from his seat, I really do think it would be time for you two to rest and enjoy just being at home. Well, Mr. Mousey wasn't at all convinced that Owl wasn't just avoiding his questions, but he nodded slowly and, rising, saw Owl to the door. Oh, I nearly forgot, exclaimed the Owl. This is for you both to keep. Jelana has the original. He handed over a parcel and made to go out. As he did, he turned and left a last remark. And well done, Mr. Mousey. Well done, Mr. Rabbit. I always knew that if it ever could be done, it would be only you two who could do it. We're all so proud of you. And with that, he was gone. The two friends stood looking at the closed door for a few moments before Mr. Rabbit's voice broke the quietness. Here, hang on. Who told him about the princess? Mr. Mousey merely shook his head as he thought. You know, I think we'll never really know the half of our own story, and whatever we tell Owl, I think he will somehow already know. Well, that makes about as much sense as a duck in a bucket, I must say, replied Mr. Rabbit, scratching his head. What did he leave us anyway? Mr. Mousey unwrapped the parcel. Oh no! Cried the rabbit. Not again! It was a book. And so we finish our final chapter. Just a few words of an epilogue. Chapter 39. It turned out to be a copy of the magic book. Unlike the first, the pages didn't change, but were permanently printed, complete with the entire set of illustrations and pictures. Mr. Mousey and Mr. Rabbit spent many happy hours reading and rereading the tales of their exploits and their friends so far away. And sometimes, when it all seemed like a dream, they would take a tent and go up onto Tarn Mountain, where they would spend the night reading the pages under the stars with the flickering flames of a campfire for light. Then it was as if they were back with Nogger, rescuing princesses or fighting alongside their Captain Rat on a swelling sea. Up on the mountain they would recall the scents under the trees in Ben Estamar, or the smell of the salt air on an open sea, and they would become silent, and together remember the days behind, and as the fire faded and flickered to embers, go back in their dreams to find friends awaiting with beaming smiles, friends from beyond the silvery sea. The end. Okay, well, thank you, boys and girls, for listening. I hope you really enjoyed that story. And until next time, if I ever read one of the other Mr. Mousey books, and you should be able to find them on Kindle. If you type in Mr. Mousey Beyond the Silver Sea, or type in my name, you should find them on Kindle. They'll be up soon. So until then, you take care, and God bless.